The garden was the wrong temperature for Wren, but she stayed because the flowers were trying to tell her something. She wasn't sure how she knew this. The blooms had no mouths, no obvious mechanism for communication. They were tall and whorled, the color of deep-sea creatures, and they pulsed with a slow bioluminescence that followed no rhythm she could yet parse. But she had been a botanist for 11 years, and she had learned, slowly and unglamorously, that plants had a habit of being more articulate than the people studying them. You just had to be quiet enough to listen. The Royal Conservatory of Vathor Prime occupied 3 vertical tiers carved into the living rock of the Palace Mountain, and it was cold in the way that expensive places are often cold deliberately. As a demonstration of control, Wren had been issued a thermal underlayer and a set of protocols that ran to 47 pages. She had read all of them. She was, therefore, absolutely certain that what she was about to do was not covered in any of them. The bloom leaned toward her. That was the only word for it. The stem curved. The petals, she would learn later that calling them petals was like calling a symphony, a collection of sounds opened a fraction wider, and the bioluminescence along their edges shifted from a deep violet to something she didn't have a color word for yet, something between grief and curiosity. Wren reached out. She touched the edge of one petal with 2 fingers. The bloom shivered. Every stem in the surrounding cluster turned toward her simultaneously, like children hearing their name called in a crowded room. "Oh," Wren said. "Sorry. Was that rude?" She said it to the flower, because she was alone in the conservatory, or believed herself to be. She had a habit of narrating her work aloud. Her graduate supervisor had found it charming and then irritating, and then, after the 3rd field season, simply inevitable. Wren could not help it. The talking helped her think. She did not notice the figure on the upper tier. Sarilith had been standing at the carved railing for 23 minutes, which was 15 minutes longer than she had intended to stay. She was not supposed to be here, not in the sense of a prohibition, but in the sense that her schedule did not account for it, and her schedule was in the way of all things pertaining to the second daughter of the Vathari crown, precise and immovable. She had come to check the fungal assessments that the court botanists had left on the secondary root wall. She had stayed because the human had arrived, and Sarilith had been, despite herself, unable to leave. From the upper tier, she could see the whole of it, the human's unguarded reach, the bloom's impossible response, the human's immediate apology to the plant, which was extraordinary, and then the long moment of quiet that followed, in which the human and the flower simply remained with each other, neither retreating. Sarilith's own light pulses were controlled, as they always were, drawn down to the faint, steady glow of professional calm. She had been practicing that suppression since she was 4 years old. The Vathari court light reader could detect the difference between contentment and suppressed agitation at 20 paces, which was why the nobility spent considerable effort learning to look like the same thing regardless of what they felt. She watched the human say sorry to the flower again, softer this time, and she pressed her fingers against the railing and made her light go very, very still. The bloom was still turned toward the human's hands when Sarilith finally walked away. The court light reader announced, formally, that the human was emotionally unwell. Wren sat in the center of the assessment chamber and tried not to let her face do anything too dramatic. This was not going well. The chamber was a circular room with tiered observation seats, the kind of architecture that was designed specifically to make whoever occupied the center feel both watched and small. 6 court assessors arranged in a horseshoe, their bioluminescence synchronized in the way of people who had practiced being collectively unimpressed for decades. The light reader, a thin, very tall Vathari named Sesh, whose own light ran in elegant, cool blue ribbons, gestured to Wren and addressed the court with the clinical detachment of someone delivering a weather report. The human's pulse light is undisciplined and changes in response to external stimuli without apparent delay or suppression, Sesh said. During the botanical walk this morning, she emitted what we have tentatively classified as pleasure signals in response to the root bloom arrangement, distress signals when she encountered the wilting section in Tier 2, and a cascade of signals that our instruments could not categorize when the secondary greenhouse played the evening tone chime. Those are called feelings, Ren said, and then regretted it immediately. Several assessors shifted. 2 of their lights dimmed in a way that she was fairly sure indicated displeasure. We are aware, Sesh said, of the human concept of feelings. Then, sorry, I'm just checking, is the diagnosis that I have them? A long pause. The diagnosis is that you do not appear able to manage them. Ren pressed her lips together. She was not going to laugh. She was absolutely not going to laugh. Right, she said. That's fair. She had been on Vathar Prime for 9 days. In that time, she had cried twice, once at the sunset from Tier 3, which had been genuinely breathtaking, and once when the junior conservatory assistant had played a folk melody on something that sounded exactly like the hurdy-gurdy her grandmother kept by the fire. She had laughed 4 times. She had told 3 people that they had done good work, touching one of them briefly on the arm in a way that had caused a minor administrative incident she was still not entirely clear on. She had not been trying to be transgressive. She had simply not understood, yet, where the lines were. The assessors conferred in the Vathari way rapid light exchanges, too fast and nuanced for Ren's beginner's eye to track. Then Sesh looked at her again. The court has assigned an observer. She will accompany you during your conservatory duties and provide a report on your integration progress. An observer, Ren repeated. Is that like a chaperone? It is an observer, Sesh said, with the finality of someone who had answered this question a very particular number of times. The door opened. Seralith walked in. Ren had not, in 9 days, spoken to the king's daughter. She had seen her twice in formal processions, standing at the exact geometric center of a cluster of attendants, her light running in those steady, controlled ribbons. The same patterns Ren had noticed all the Vathari nobility wore like a uniform. But up close, Seralith was different in ways that were hard to name. Her light pulses were very, very still. Not just disciplined, effortful. Ren knew what effortful stillness looked like. She had seen it in patients waiting for test results, in children holding themselves together in rooms full of grieving adults. She had seen it in herself, in mirrors, on the bad days. I don't need a report written, Ren said, which was not what she'd planned to say. But if you want to come see the flowers, you're welcome to. Seralith looked at her for a long moment. Her light did not change. The purpose of my presence is to observe. Sure, Ren said. You can observe the flowers too. The assessor's lights shifted again. Seralith's Ren was almost certain flickered, very briefly, at the edge of something. They walked to the conservatory in silence, which Ren found comfortable enough. She had field partnered with people who didn't talk much. The trick was not to fill the quiet with anything anxious. The Tier 2 greenhouse was warm and smelled of copper and something sweet, and Ren went directly to the wilting section she'd flagged the day before. She crouched down, examining the base of a cluster where the stems were going pale and soft, and pulled out her field notebook paper, which had apparently caused its own small incident at customs, and began sketching. You draw them, Seralith said from behind her. It helps me notice things the scanner misses. Ren tilted the notebook so Seralith could see the sketch of the root structure. Also, I just like it. Is drawing considered emotionally unwell? No. A pause. Drawing is assessed as productive. High praise. Ren turned back to the wilting stem and pressed 2 fingers gently against the base. The plant didn't move. She frowned. This one's going in the wrong direction. The bioluminescence is retreating from the edges. You can see it here and here. She looked up. Seralith was close enough to see, her light running in very careful, slow ribbons. She was looking at the plant. What does it feel like? Ren asked. The suppression. When you're keeping your light like that. She asked it the way she asked everything openly, with genuine curiosity, not looking away. She asked it the way she'd asked the flower if touching it had been rude. Seralith was quiet for long enough that Ren thought she'd overstepped again. Then, like holding water in your hands. Ren considered that. Does it spill? Occasionally, Seralith said, very carefully. It does. Ren nodded and wrote something in her notebook. Seralith, watching her, found that she could not determine what. The blight came from the eastern root wall, and by morning it had eaten 3 tears. Ren smelled it before she saw it. A sourness under the copper-sweet conservatory air. Wrong the way a missed note is wrong. Immediately and obviously wrong, even if you can't name the exact musical principle being violated. She was in the Tier 3 upper walk when the smell hit her, and she turned and went back down the stairs at a pace that was almost running, which was, as it turned out, another undignified human characteristic she would not have time to be embarrassed about. The eastern wall was gray, not the gray of Veathari stone. A living gray, spreading slowly through the root systems of every plant in the quadrant, climbing the stalks, consuming the bioluminescence as it climbed. The night blooms had gone dark entirely. Several of the root cultures that had been in the conservatory for longer than Ren's species had been spacefaring were simply gone, their nutrient beds colonized, their histories eaten. The court botanists arrived within the hour. There were 4 of them, and they moved through the affected zones with scanners and spoke to each other in rapid light exchanges. And then they stood together, and their lights went the particular cold, even blue that Ren was learning to recognize as the Veathari equivalent of, "We have decided something difficult. Containment is not viable," the senior botanist said. "The organism propagates via root contact and aerial spore. We recommend controlled burn of the eastern quadrant before it reaches the central root system." Ren looked at the gray wall, and then at the botanist. How long has the central root system been growing? 407 years. Right. She was already walking back toward the wall. Then, we're not burning it. The organism will reach. Then we have to move faster than the organism. She crouched at the edge of the gray and pulled out her scanner, her notebook, a small specimen jar. She was already thinking not in the straight lines of protocol, but in the messy, associative, occasionally ridiculous way she thought when the problem was interesting. Fungal propagation via root contact meant there was a signal being passed along a chemical handshake between host and parasite. She'd written her dissertation on interrupted chemical signaling in Earth-based mycorrhizal networks. She had never expected that to be relevant in a situation like this, but there it was. She became aware, after a while, that she was no longer alone. Seralith stood at her shoulder, not speaking, her light steady. "You should probably go," Ren said, not unkindly. "There's going to be a lot of touching things." "I am aware." Seralith picked up one of the spare scanners from Ren's kit without asking permission. "Tell me what to look for." They worked through the night. Seralith had never worked through a night before. She had stayed up late studying, had attended early ceremonies, had once maintained a vigil for a dying court official that had lasted until the 3rd hour of morning. But she had never worked like this, with her hands, in her good clothes, on her knees in the substrate. taking instructions from a human who had stopped using full sentences somewhere around the second hour and had switched entirely to a language of gestures and pointing and the occasional urgent, there, no, that one. Yes, Wren talked constantly. Not to Serelith, or not only to Serelith. She talked to the plants as she worked, the same way she'd spoken to the bloom on the first day. She said things like, "Okay, I know. I'm trying to find the edges, and don't you give up on me." And once, when a treatment approach failed and the gray continued its slow advance, a word in a language Serelith didn't recognize that she suspected was profanity. Then Wren sat back on her heels and was quiet and stared at the wall, and Serelith watched her think. It was a visible process. The human's face moved through several configurations: frustration, doubt, a peculiar expression that Serelith had no category for, and then something changed, and Wren reached into her kit and pulled out a vial of something cloudy and orange that she held up to the light. "Mycorrhizal buffer," she said. "Earth-derived. I don't know if it'll work on Vathari root biology." A pause. "It might make it worse. Will you try it?" Wren looked at her. "Yeah," she said. "I'll try it." She applied it to the leading edge of the gray, and they both held very still and waited. The gray stopped. Not immediately, not dramatically. It took 40 minutes, during which Wren refilled the application 3 times and talked to the root system in a low, steady voice, the way people talk to sick animals or sleeping children. But it stopped. The advancing edge held. Then, at the very leading point, the faintest ghost of violet bioluminescence returned to a stem that had gone dark. Wren let out a long breath. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against her knees. "You knew it might not work," Serelith said. "Yeah, and you tried it anyway. Someone had to." Serelith looked at the stem with its ghost of returning light. In 400 years, she thought, no one had ever simply tried something on the root system without 3 committees and a formal proposal. She looked at Wren's shaking hands and the smears of substrate on her good clothes and the field notebook that was now incomprehensible with rapid sketches, and she understood, for the first time, what it looked like to love something enough to fail at saving it 6 times before the 7th way worked. "You should sleep," Serelith said. "I should finish the containment barrier. Then I'll stay until you do." Wren looked up at her. Something in her face went soft and honest. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that Serelith felt she could see all the way through. She kept her light very, very still. The king's light burned cold and precise when he entered the conservatory. Wren was on her knees, treating the secondary edge when she heard the footsteps multiple, synchronized, the specific rhythm of a formal party, and looked up to find King Vathar Soleth III in the entrance archway, flanked by 4 attendants and the court light reader. His bioluminescence was extraordinary up close. Deep blue-white, perfectly controlled, running in patterns so complex they seemed almost mathematical. He was very tall and very old, and he looked at the conservatory the way people look at things they own. Wren stood. She was dirty and exhausted, and she had a leaf in her hair, which she discovered later. Serelith, who had been working beside her at the secondary edge, stood too. Her light went absolutely, crystallinely still. The king surveyed the eastern quadrant. He surveyed the containment markers Wren had placed overnight. He looked at the restored bioluminescence on the treated sections. Then he looked at his daughter, and then at Wren, and the light reader stepped forward and began to speak. The royal surveillance of conservatory grounds is continuous, Sesh said, in the tone of someone who has prepared this sentence. The footage has been reviewed. The human has committed 11 separate violations of touch protocol in the past 36 hours. The princess has committed 4. By court statute, the human's permit is revoked and she is to be removed from the palace grounds. The princess is reassigned to the outer court observation duties pending review. The courtier's lights ran in careful, controlled acknowledgement. This was the expected sequence of events. Everyone understood this. Seralith's light pulsed. It was the first time Ren had ever seen it happen, the controls slipping, just slightly. A warm amber breaking through the cool blue discipline, like something rising to the surface. Seralith pressed it back down immediately, but not before the court light reader's eyes moved to her, noting it, and not before 2 of the attendants' lights shifted in the way that meant they had seen. Ren understood what this was costing. She had spent 11 days learning to read this language imperfectly, but she understood this. She did not argue about the violations. She did not make a speech. She had nothing here, no standing, no power, no leverage. She was a botanist from Earth who talked to plants and had a tendency to cry at sunsets. She turned to the king. "May I say goodbye to the conservatory?" she asked. "Before I go." A pause. The king's light ran an intricate pattern she couldn't parse. Then, "You may." She went inside. She moved quickly, with purpose, taking the path through the restored eastern section to the part of Tier 2. She knew Seralith knew best, the section where the secondary root cultures lived, the ones they'd spent the most time over the past several days. Seralith followed, falling into step beside her with the quiet automaticity of the past week, and Ren didn't look back to see if anyone else was coming. "Okay," Ren said softly. "This one, the root exposure here, you want to keep the moisture level at about 60%. You can tell by the way the base stems feel. They'll get waxy if it's too low." She was talking fast, touching each specimen briefly, moving through the tiers. "The night blooms need their bioluminescence levels checked after any treatment. The pulse should be steady. If it's flickering, it means the cellular structure is stressed. This cluster in the corner, they're old. They don't like change. They'll sulk for a week if you adjust the temperature more than 2 degrees in any direction." Seralith moved with her. Ren could feel her attention steady, precise, the same quality of focus she'd had at the secondary edge in the 3rd hour of morning. "The one that started this," Ren said, stopping at the bloom. It was fully restored, its petals cycling through their violet to grief to something else wavelengths. "She'll tell you when she needs something. You just have to be willing to listen." "You're telling me how to take care of them," Seralith said. "Yeah, you know you won't be here." "Yeah." Ren looked at the bloom. "But you will." Seralith was quiet. Her light was so carefully controlled that Ren couldn't read it at all, which she was learning meant it was the opposite of nothing. From the entrance, the king watched them. Ren didn't know this until later. She was focused on the bloom, which had turned toward her hands again, and she didn't see the king standing in the archway with his cold, precise light doing something complex and slow that the court light reader, watching from beside him, could not categorize in any of the existing 43 emotional registers. Seralith pressed her palm flat against the root wall, the first deliberate touch she had ever chosen, and held it there. The court watched. This was the second extraordinary thing she had done in 30 seconds. The first had been invoking the conservator's right. The right was old, older than the current palace, older than the formalized court structure, old enough that the light reader had gone very still in the way of someone recalling a protocol they had memorized in school and never expected to use. It dated from the era when the conservatories were the most sacred spaces on Vathar Prime, when the keeper of a living collection was considered to hold a responsibility that superseded most civil law. The keeper could name a successor. The successor's right to remain could not be revoked by a lesser authority than the conservator's court, a body that had not convened in 300 years. The king was not a lesser authority. But the sacred law was not the king's law. Sarilith had done the research in the 3 hours between the king's departure and this morning. She had been very thorough. "I invoke the conservator's right," she had said to the full court, standing in the center of the assessment chamber where Wren had sat 11 days ago looking small and unmanaged. The Royal Conservatory of Vithar Prime requires a keeper with both the knowledge and the, she had paused, very briefly, the willingness to learn. "I name Wren of Earth as my chosen successor under the terms of the ancient accession." The chamber had gone very, very bright. Several courtiers' lights had gone briefly uncontrolled surprise, confusion, something that in a less formal setting might have been called awe. The light reader had opened their mouth and then closed it and then opened it again. Sarilith had pressed her palm to the root wall of the conservator's chamber. The root wall had responded. The bioluminescence along its surface had shifted and turned, the same way the bloom had turned on the first day, and everyone in the chamber had seen it. Now, they stood in the Royal Conservatory, the full court, the king, Wren, who had been summoned from the temporary holding quarters where she'd spent the night assembling her field kit in preparation for departure, and trying not to think too hard about the bloom, and Sarilith stood with her palm against the wall and her light running amber, unhidden. For the first time in her adult life, the king said nothing. He looked at his daughter's hand against the ancient root wall. He looked at the court, whose lights were cycling through genuinely unprecedented configurations. He looked at Wren, who was standing at the edge of the gathering with leaf traces still on her knees from the previous morning's work, and an expression on her face that was so transparently moved that the light reader made a small, involuntary note in his record and then stopped, because it didn't fit any of the existing categories either. "She asked me what the suppression felt like," Sarilith said, to no one in particular. Her voice was steady. Her light was not. "On the third day. She asked it the way you ask about a flower, because she wanted to know. Not because it was wrong, because she was curious." No one moved. The conservatory breathed around them, its bioluminescence cycling through the quiet pulse patterns of early morning. "She talked to the plants," Sarilith said, and the plants answered. "I don't think that's a disorder." A pause. "I think that's what a keeper does." Wren looked at the floor. She was not crying, but it was close, and she'd stopped pretending it wasn't. The king's light ran one long, slow pattern, then another. Then he turned and walked toward the entrance, and he did not speak, and he did not rescind the naming, and the court followed him, and the light reader followed, and the conservatory went quiet. Sarilith lowered her hand from the root wall and turned around. Wren crossed the distance between them and held out a small pot, one of the ones she'd prepared in the holding quarters in the dark hours of the night, not knowing why, only knowing it felt necessary. A cutting from the bloom, wrapped at the base with the specialized media that would keep it viable. The petals cycled violet to grief, to that unnamable color that lived between them. Sarilith took it with both hands. She looked at it for a long moment. Her light ran amber, and then something warmer, some color that wasn't in any formal register, and she didn't try to bring it back. "You'll need to show me how to repot this," she said, "when it outgrows the cutting stage." "That's a few months out," Wren said. "Yes," Sarilith looked up. "So you'll have time." They went back to the secondary root cultures, and Wren started from the beginning, explaining the moisture levels, and Sarilith asked 3 questions that suggested she'd retained everything from the previous day, and the morning light came through the Tier 2 viewport and fell across the substrate beds in long pale strips, and the bloom in Cerulith's hands pulsed slowly, steadily, the color of something between grief and curiosity, which was, Wren had come to understand, just another word for learning.